Hello everyone, this is History PhD channel, where we explore the most tragic chapters of human history. Today, I would like to lead you on an emotional journey, a story of fate and will, of suffering and greatness. The life of Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. From a boy growing up in a poor wooden shack in the Kentucky wilderness, from a self-taught lawyer by the flickering light of a fire, to the man who led a nation through the bloodiest civil war in American history, Lincoln experienced countless ups and downs. He lost his beloved mother at the age of 9, witnessed the deaths of 3 children, struggled with lifelong depression, and faced the deep divisions of an entire nation. But it was from these sufferings that he found the strength to liberate 4 million insurgents, to heal the wounds of the nation, and to etch his name into the millennium as one of the greatest leaders of all time. If you're a history enthusiast, curious about what makes a true leader, or simply want to gain a deeper understanding of the period that shaped modern America, then stay with us. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes of this journey of discovery. Because the story of Abraham Lincoln is not just a story of the past. It's also a lesson in perseverance, in love of humanity, and in the belief that even in the darkest circumstances, the light of justice can prevail. Now, join me on a journey to explore the tragic life of Abraham Lincoln, a man, a legend. On February 12, 1809, in a simple wooden shack with a cold earthen floor on the Sinking Spring Ranch in Hardin County, Kentucky, a baby boy was born amidst the howling winds of the North American winter. The child was named Abraham Lincoln after his grandfather, who had died in a Native American attack in 1786. No one could have imagined that this child born into poverty would become one of the greatest leaders in human history. Lincoln's father, Thomas Lincoln, was a rough, illiterate man who could barely sign his name. He was a farmer and carpenter, always struggling financially. Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks, is described as a gentle, deeply religious woman. Their family belonged to the Separate Baptist Church, a strict Protestant denomination that forbade alcohol, dancing, and, most importantly, opposed slavery. This sowed the seeds for the liberal views to which Lincoln would later dedicate his life. Abraham had an older sister named Sarah, born in 1807, and a younger brother named Thomas Jr., who died as an infant. In 1811, when Abraham was only 2 years old, the family had to move to Knob Creek Farm, 8 miles to the north, due to a land ownership dispute. Thomas Lincoln had lost hundreds of acres of land in Kentucky because of lawsuits over ownership, a painful reality that led him to seek a safer place for his family. At Knob Creek, Lincoln's earliest memories began to form. He later recounted, "My earliest memory is of Knob Creek. This is where young Abraham first witnessed marching troops on the Louisville-Nashville Highway during the War of 1812, where he saw enslaved people being driven by their overseers. Images that would remain etched in his mind forever." In December 1816, when Abraham was 7 years old, Thomas Lincoln decided to leave Kentucky. The reason was not only the legal troubles over land, but also the widespread slavery in Kentucky, something he and his wife could not accept. The family headed to Indiana, a newly surveyed land with anti-slavery laws under the Northwest Ordinance. They arrived at Little Pigeon Creek community in Spencer County, Indiana, a desolate area with no trails leading to it. Thomas and his family had to build a half-faced camp, a rudimentary structure made of logs and branches with one side completely open to the outside environment, with only a flickering fire for warmth. Abraham, then 8 years old, along with his father and sister, had to chop down trees, clear bushes, dig holes, build fences, and plow the land. It was the harsh life of the frontier. In a later letter, Lincoln recalled, "The howling of the Black Panthers, the bears that preyed on our pigs, and the poverty of Indiana frontier life were truly painful at times." This was no exaggeration. The family lived in a 360-square-foot wooden shack with an earthen floor, no glass windows, and only one entrance. But it was in these harsh circumstances that Lincoln's character began to be forged. In October 1818, disaster struck. An epidemic called milk sickness swept through Pigeon Creek. This mysterious disease caused vomiting, weakness, and death. Today we know it was caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten poisonous white snake root. Nancy Hanks Lincoln contracted the disease and died on October 5, 1818, at the age of 34. Abraham, then 9 years old, witnessed his mother's agonizing death. Thomas Lincoln had to build the coffin himself from planks he split. There was no priest, no proper ceremony. Nancy was buried on a hill in the woods with a simple wooden headstone. Young Abraham stood gazing at his mother's grave in the cold, and a part of his heart was buried with her. Lincoln rarely spoke of his mother later in life, but he once confessed, "All that I am, or hope to become, I owe to my angelic mother." The winter following Nancy's death was the darkest period of Lincoln's childhood. Sarah, then 11 years old, had to shoulder the household chores. Abraham, Dennis Hanks, Nancy's 19-year-old cousin, and Thomas Lincoln lived in the cold house, devoid of a woman's presence. They ate meager meals, wore dirty clothes, and were consumed by sadness. But then, in December 1819, Thomas Lincoln returned to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and married Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children: Elizabeth, 13 years old, John D., 9 years old, and Matilda, 8 years old. On December 2, 1819, Thomas took Sarah and the children to Indiana in a wagon full of belongings: furniture, bedding, dishes, and even books. Sarah Bush Lincoln was an extraordinary woman. She possessed energy, love, and fairness. She treated both groups of children as her own, but she had a special affection for Abraham. She immediately recognized his intelligence and thirst for knowledge. Abraham later called her his angel mother and said that she did everything a loving mother could do. Sarah brought order and warmth to the family. She cleaned the house, mended the children's clothes, and encouraged Abraham to read. While Thomas Lincoln couldn't understand why his son loved reading so much and wanted him to focus on farming, Sarah protected Abraham and facilitated his education. Lincoln's formal education was extremely limited. In total, he attended school for only about 12 months in his entire life, brief periods at blab schools, borderland schools where students read aloud to memorize lessons. His teachers were Zachariah Riney and Caleb Hazel in Kentucky, and Azell Dorsey, Andrew Crawford, and James Swaney in Indiana. They taught him basic reading, writing, and elementary math. But Lincoln's real education came from self-study. He read every book he could find: the King James Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, The Pilgrim's Progress, and especially Parson Weems' The Life of George Washington. The book about Washington fascinated him. The story of a poor boy who became a national hero ignited Lincoln's imagination. One night, Lincoln borrowed a book about Washington from a neighbor named Josiah Crawford. He placed it near a crack in the wall to read, but it rained that night and soaked the book. The next morning, Lincoln went to Crawford, admitted his mistake, and asked what he could do to make amends. Crawford asked him to work 3 days hauling corn to pay for the book. Lincoln agreed and worked diligently. This was his first lesson in responsibility and honor, values that would shape him for the rest of his life. Friends recall Lincoln always having a book in his hand. He read while plowing, with the book propped up at the end of the furrow. He read by the fire until late at night, his eyes bloodshot and his hair disheveled. Dennis Hanks said, "I never saw him bored with books. He read everything he could find." Lincoln also honed his oratorical skills from a young age. He would often climb trees or sheds and preach, telling stories to his friends and brothers. He imitated the speech patterns of missionaries and lawyers. His stepmother recalled, he could talk about any topic. He had become a brilliant and eloquent speaker before he turned 21. But not everything was smooth sailing. Thomas Lincoln, though loving his son, did not understand Abraham's intellectual aspirations. He wanted him to become a farmer or carpenter like himself. He often hired Abraham to work for other farmers and kept all the wages, a custom at the time, but one that created tension between father and son. Abraham felt exploited, but he never complained publicly. In January 1828, another tragedy struck. Sarah Lincoln Grigsby, Abraham's older sister, died in childbirth at the age of 21. She had married Aaron Grigsby in 1826 when she was only 19. Sarah died along with her unborn child due to complications during childbirth. Abraham, then 18, was deeply distressed. Sarah had been his childhood companion and the sister who had cared for him after his mother's death. It appears Aaron Grigsby and his family did not call a doctor in time, and Lincoln blamed them for his sister's death. This resentment was so deep that years later, Lincoln wrote a scathing satirical poem about the Grigsby family. This was a rare sign of Lincoln's indignation, a man usually calm and tolerant. Sarah's death made Lincoln more acutely aware of the fragility of life. He had lost his mother at age 9, his younger brother when he was still a child, and now his sister. These losses contributed to the formation of Lincoln's melancholic, quiet personality, what was later diagnosed as clinical depression. In March 1830, when Abraham had just turned 21, the Lincoln family migrated again, this time to Illinois. Fearing another outbreak of milk sickness, and having heard about the fertile lands in Illinois from John Hanks, Nancy's cousin, Thomas decided to move. 13 members of the extended Lincoln family set off: Thomas, Sarah Bush, Abraham, his second son, John D. Johnston, Dennis Hanks with his wife Elizabeth, also Abraham's second sister, and 4 children, and Squire Hall with his wife Matilda, another Abraham's second sister, and son. Abraham drove the ox carts. 6 feet 4 inches tall, approximately 1.93 meters, thin but sturdy and incredibly strong, the young man looked different. He could chop wood faster than anyone, could wrestle the strongest fighters to the ground, and then could pull a plow all day without tiring. But his mind was focused on other things, not land or livestock, but knowledge, justice, and opportunity. The family settled in Macon County, Illinois, near Decatur. They built another log cabin, cleared the land, and prepared for their first winter. But the winter of 1830 to 1831 was one of the harshest in Illinois history, known as the Winter of Deep Snow. The snow piled up several feet high, livestock froze to death, and food supplies dwindled. When spring arrived in 1831, Abraham had made his decision. He had fulfilled his duty to his father, helping him build a new farm. Now, at 22, Abraham Lincoln would forge his own path. No mentor, no formal education, no possessions or money. Only an iron will, innate intelligence, and a vague belief that life held more than chopping trees and plowing fields. Lincoln never returned to live with his father. In 1851, when Thomas Lincoln was dying, Abraham refused to visit him. When he died, Abraham did not attend the funeral. The tension between father and son was never resolved. Some historians suggest that Thomas did not appreciate his son's ambitions, while Abraham felt unsupported by his father in pursuing his dreams. This was an emotional wound that Lincoln carried with him throughout his life. In April 1831, 3 young men, Abraham Lincoln, John Hanks, and John D. Johnston, accepted a job for a merchant named Denton Offutt. Their task was to transport a flat-bottomed boat full of goods from Springfield down the Sangamon River, then on to the Illinois and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans. This wasn't Lincoln's first trip to New Orleans. He had made a similar journey in 1828 where he had first witnessed the slave market, a sight that haunted him ever since. But this 1831 voyage would change Lincoln's destiny in ways no one could have predicted. Near the village of New Salem, about 20 miles northwest of Springfield, the heavily laden boat became stranded on the dam of the Sangamon River. Water flooded the vessel, threatening to sink it completely. While others panicked, Lincoln calmly analyzed the situation. He directed the unloading of some of the cargo, drilled holes in the stern of the boat to release the water, and then carefully guided the boat across the dam. The villagers of New Salem, about 25 families who lived there, gathered on the riverbank to watch this miraculous rescue. Denton Offutt was very impressed. Upon returning from New Orleans, he offered Lincoln the job of managing a general store he planned to open in New Salem. Lincoln agreed. In July 1831, Abraham Lincoln officially moved to New Salem, a small village founded in 1829 by James Rutledge and John M. Cameron on land 100 feet above the Sangamon River. The village was built around a mill constructed by Rutledge and Cameron. Here, farmers from miles away came to mill grain, trade goods, and socialize. New Salem had the potential to become a thriving town. At the time Lincoln arrived, New Salem had about 100 residents, 2 shops, a tavern/hotel, a school/church, a tailor shop, a blacksmith, a carpenter, and 2 doctors. It was a vibrant community with diverse people, not just farmers, but also intellectuals, merchants, and artisans. Lincoln worked at Offutt's shop, selling goods, chatting with customers, and quickly became a well-liked figure in the village. Tall and thin, with a high-pitched voice and a wild, rustic manner of speaking, Lincoln could make people laugh with his stories and jokes. But he also seemed serious, avid reader, and a deep thinker. What truly brought Lincoln into the New Salem community was a wrestling match. Jack Armstrong was the leader of a local youth group called the Clary's Grove Boys, known for their aggressive nature, drinking habits, and fighting prowess. They viewed Lincoln as an outsider and wanted to test him. Offutt, Lincoln's owner, boasted that Lincoln could beat anyone in the area. Jack Armstrong, a local wrestler, accepted the challenge. One day, the whole village gathered to watch the match. Lincoln, unwilling to fight, could not refuse without losing face. The wrestling match began. Armstrong was strong and experienced, but Lincoln was taller, had longer arms, and possessed extraordinary strength from years of logging. The two wrestled fiercely, neither gaining the upper hand. Seeing Lincoln about to win, members of the Clary's Grove Boys threatened to storm in. Lincoln, enraged, declared he would beat each one of them if they dared interfere. Jack Armstrong, impressed by Lincoln's courage and strength, stood up, shook Lincoln's hand, and declared himself his friend. From then on, Lincoln was accepted and protected by the Clary's Grove Boys. This was a crucial turning point. Lincoln was recognized not only for his physical prowess, but also for his character. Later, Jack Armstrong became one of Lincoln's most loyal friends. Offutt's shop did quite well for a time, but then failed in 1832. New Salem had high hopes of becoming a river port, but the Sangamon River was too shallow and unsuitable for steamships. When the shop closed, Lincoln was unemployed. Along with William F. Berry, Lincoln bought another grocery store in 1833. They even had a liquor license. But Berry was an alcoholic, and Lincoln lacked business acumen. The store declined steadily. Berry drank up the inventory, failed to pay his suppliers, and eventually died in 1835, leaving Lincoln with a mountain of debt of about $1,100, a huge sum at the time. Lincoln called it the National Store, a self-deprecating irony. But he didn't run away. He decided to pay off every penny of the debt, even if it took years. This was a lesson in financial responsibility and personal honor. People began calling Lincoln Honest Abe, a nickname that would stick with him for life. In 1832, while the store was still operating, a conflict with the Native Americans erupted, the Black Hawk War. A leader named Sauk Blackhawk led his group from Iowa back to Illinois to reclaim their ancestral lands. The governor of Illinois called for volunteer militia forces. Lincoln, 23 years old, enlisted in the army. Something extraordinary happened. Volunteers from the Richland Company elected Lincoln as captain. This was the first time Lincoln had been elected to a leadership position. He later said that no achievement in his life made him prouder than this event. However, Lincoln and his unit never saw combat. They marched through Illinois, digging trenches, setting up camp, and patrolling, but never confronted the enemy. Lincoln once told a humorous story about bloody battles with mosquitoes and said his only bravery was numerous clashes with wild vegetation. But a serious incident occurred. An elderly Native American wandered into Lincoln's camp, claiming to be a friend of the white people and possessing a travel permit. Some soldiers wanted to kill the old man, believing all Native Americans were enemies. Lincoln stood up to protect the old man, placing himself between him and the guns. When the soldiers accused Lincoln of cowardice, Lincoln declared, "Anyone who wants to kill this man will have to go through me first." Lincoln's courage and moral principles saved the old man's life. After 3 months, Lincoln was discharged as a private. He had been demoted for a minor disciplinary violation, dropping his weapon in the barracks. But this military experience was valuable. Lincoln learned about leadership, about managing men with differing wills, and about standing up for what was right, even when unpopular. Also in 1832, before enlisting in the Army, Lincoln decided to run for the Illinois General Assembly. This was a bold leap from an unknown salesman into politics. Lincoln drafted a campaign statement published on March 9, 1832, in the Sangamo Journal. In it, he focused on improving river transport, supporting education, and opposing excessively high interest rates. The most remarkable part is the conclusion. "I was born and raised in poverty. My ambition is to earn the respect of my fellow citizens by proving myself worthy of that respect." This is an honest and humble confession from a 23-year-old candidate who has no money, no powerful family, only intelligence and sincerity. The election took place on August 6, 1832. Lincoln came in 8th out of 13 candidates. This was Lincoln's only defeat in a direct confrontation with voters. But there is a noteworthy detail. In the New Salem area, where people knew Lincoln personally, he received 277 out of 300 votes. This demonstrates that those who knew Lincoln trusted him. The problem was that he wasn't widely known. This failure did not discourage Lincoln. Instead, it taught him a valuable lesson. In politics, building relationships and personal reputation is paramount. After his shop failed, Lincoln needed to find a way to make a living. On May 7, 1833, he was appointed manager of the New Salem post office. It was a small job. New Salem was just a third-rate post office with little mail, but it had a great advantage. Lincoln could read all the newspapers before delivering them. He read every newspaper he could find, from Louisville, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and even from New York. This was how Lincoln educated himself about politics, economics, and national affairs. Lincoln carried letters in his hat as he walked around the village, delivering them personally to recipients, a service that wasn't mandatory but demonstrated his concern for the community. When the post office closed in 1836, Lincoln was found to owe $17. When the auditors came to collect the money, Lincoln opened a cloth bag and counted out the exact amount. He had kept the money for years, knowing that one day he would have to pay it back. At the same time, Lincoln also worked as a land surveyor. He learned the trade from John Calhoun, a surveyor in Sangamon County, with the help of books and practice. This work required precise mathematics, fairness, and honesty qualities Lincoln possessed. He measured plots of land, delineated farm boundaries, and mapped new cities. This work took him to every corner of the county, allowed him to meet hundreds of people, and solidified his reputation as a trustworthy person. During his years in New Salem, Lincoln met Anne Rutledge, the daughter of James Rutledge, the village's co-founder. Anne, born in 1813, was tall, blonde, and blue-eyed, described as beautiful and intelligent. She helped her father run the Rutledge Inn, where Lincoln often ate. The relationship between Lincoln and Anne is one of the most debated historical mysteries. Some historians believe they were engaged, or at least intended to marry. Others argue that this love story was exaggerated by storytellers seeking to add a romantic element to Lincoln's life. What we know for sure, Anne was engaged to a man named John McNamara, later discovered his real name was John McNeil, who came to New Salem in 1829 and became successful in business. In 1832, McNamara left New Salem to return east to visit family, promising to come back. But he didn't write and disappeared without a trace. Anne began to suspect he had abandoned her. During this time, Lincoln and Anne became closer. According to later accounts from friends and family, they often talked during breaks, took walks along the riverbank, and seemed to be developing deep feelings for each other. Some friends recalled Lincoln appearing happier during this period. But then, tragedy struck. In August 1835, Anne Rutledge contracted typhoid fever. In an era without antibiotics, this disease was often fatal. Anne was bedridden for weeks, suffering from high fever, delirium, and gradually weakening. Lincoln visited her frequently, sitting by her bedside and holding her hand. On August 25, 1835, Anne Rutledge died at the age of 22. Anne's death plunged Lincoln into a profound mental crisis. Friends recalled him wandering through the woods, talking to himself, neither eating nor sleeping, and uttering words of despair. Mentor Rutledge, Anne's brother, said, "I never saw a man so distressed." Isaac Cogdell, another friend, later recounted, "Lincoln told me that he loved Anne Rutledge more than anything in the world." His friends feared Lincoln would commit suicide. They confiscated all sharp objects from him and never left him alone. Bowling Green and his wife Nancy took Lincoln to their home to care for him. Gradually, over several weeks, Lincoln began to recover. But he never fully recovered from his loss. Some modern historians argue that the story of Lincoln and Anne has been embellished, that Lincoln may not have loved her as deeply as it is portrayed. But whatever the truth, it is clear that Anne's death had a profound impact on Lincoln's psyche. This was the first time Lincoln experienced a severe clinical depression, a condition that would recur many times throughout his life. Lincoln's poetry during this period reflects profound sadness. He wrote about death, the fragility of life, and the yearning for liberation from suffering. But he also found meaning in his work, in serving the community, and in political ambition. Perhaps it was Lincoln's own suffering that propelled him forward. If he could not find personal happiness, he could at least try to make the lives of others better. In 1834, Lincoln ran again for the Illinois House of Representatives. This time, with the reputation he had built through his work in postal administration and surveying, and with his extensive network of friends throughout the county, he won. At age 25, Lincoln became one of 4 representatives from Sangamon County. The Illinois House of Representatives met in Vandalia, the state capital at the time. Lincoln bought a used suit for $60, the largest expenditure of his life up to that point, to look more presentable. He set off for Vandalia in December 1834, feeling both eager and anxious. In Vandalia, Lincoln met experienced politicians, learning about law, debate, and the art of compromise. He was a member of the Whig Party, which advocated for economic modernization, infrastructure development, and a national bank. During his first term, Lincoln primarily observed and learned, speaking only when necessary. But he quickly stood out. Taller than everyone else in the room, with a clear voice and captivating storytelling ability, Lincoln drew attention. He had the ability to explain complex issues in simple language and always sought practical solutions rather than empty slogans. In 1836, Lincoln was re-elected with the highest number of votes among the four candidates for Sangamon County. He was re-elected again in 1838 and 1840. By the end of his final term, Lincoln had become one of the state's most influential legislators, leader of the Whig faction, and recognized as a masterful orator. While serving in the House of Representatives, Lincoln realized that many of the most successful legislators were lawyers. Law was not just a profession, but also a tool of power. If Lincoln wanted to advance further in politics, he needed to become a lawyer. The problem was that Lincoln didn't have a college degree, no law course, and no money to go to school. But at that time, Illinois allowed anyone with good moral character and a basic understanding of law to become a lawyer through self-study and an exam. Lincoln borrowed books from John Todd Stewart, a lawyer and fellow member of the House of Commons, who encouraged Lincoln to pursue law. Key books included Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England and other legal texts. Lincoln read, took notes, and memorized legal principles. He studied whenever he had a spare moment, on the road between New Salem and Vandalia, during breaks between House sessions, and at night by the light of an oil lamp. Friends recalled seeing Lincoln lying under a tree, reading Blackstone, his long legs stretched up the trunk. On September 9, 1836, Lincoln received his bar license from the Illinois Supreme Court. He moved to Springfield, the newly chosen state capital, partly thanks to the efforts of Lincoln and Sangamon County delegates, and became a partner with John Todd Stewart. From an orphaned boy with no formal education and no possessions, Abraham Lincoln, at the age of 27, became a lawyer and state legislator. This is not just a story of personal ambition, but a testament to the power of willpower, self-education, and belief in the potential for human achievement. In April 1837, 28-year-old Abraham Lincoln rode to Springfield with only $7 in his pocket. He entered the store of Joshua Speed, a grocery store keeper, and asked for the price of a set of bedding. Speed quoted him $17. Lincoln admitted, "I can't pay that much right now. If you let me owe you until Christmas, and if I live and my business prospers, I will pay you. But if I fail in this, I don't know when I will be able to pay." Speed looked at Lincoln, tall, thin, with a melancholy in his eyes, and made an offer. "You look quite poor," Speed said. "I have a large bed upstairs. If you don't mind sharing it with me, you can stay there for free." Lincoln carried his saddlebag upstairs, set it down, and came back down with a beaming face. "Great, Speed! I've moved!" The friendship between Lincoln and Speed became one of the most important relationships in Lincoln's life. Speed, the son of a wealthy Kentucky family, was well-educated and knowledgeable in literature and politics. The two often stayed up late talking about philosophy, religion, women, and ambition. Speed became Lincoln's confidant, the only person with whom Lincoln could completely confide. As a partner of John Todd Stewart, Lincoln quickly built a reputation as a talented lawyer. He specialized in land cases, contracts, and civil disputes. Lincoln had a special ability to persuade juries. He spoke the language of ordinary people, told relatable stories, and was always honest. One fellow lawyer remarked, Lincoln never represented a case he knew was wrong. In 1841, Lincoln ended his partnership with Stewart and formed a new firm with Stephen T. Logan, one of Illinois' best lawyers. Logan taught Lincoln legal techniques, how to draft rigorous documents, and how to study case law. Under Logan's guidance, Lincoln became a truly outstanding lawyer. In 1844, Lincoln founded his own law firm with William H. Herndon, a young lawyer who was then only 9 years old. Herndon and Lincoln maintained their partnership until Lincoln became president. Herndon later wrote, "Lincoln was the most honest man I ever met. He would never represent a bad case if he knew it." Lincoln also became a circular lawyer, traveling around the courts in various counties of Illinois. On horseback or in a carriage, he went from town to town handling local cases. These trips lasted weeks, sometimes months. It was a harsh life, sleeping in dilapidated inns, eating poor quality food, traveling in all kinds of weather. But it gave Lincoln the opportunity to meet thousands of people, understand the lives of ordinary citizens, and build a wide political network. In late 1839, at a ball at the home of Ninian and Elizabeth Edwards, Lincoln met Mary Todd. Mary was born on December 13, 1818, in Lexington, Kentucky, into a wealthy family of slaves. Her father, Robert Smith Todd, was a prominent Whig banker and politician. Her mother, Eliza Parker Todd, died when Mary was 6 years old. Her father remarried Betsy Humphreys, whom Mary did not like. Mary was well educated, attending Ward's Academy and Mentel's Academy in Lexington. She was fluent in French, literature, poetry, drama, and etiquette. She was 5 feet 2 inches tall, approximately 1.57 meters, plump, with brown hair and sharp blue eyes. She was described as attractive, intelligent, quick-witted in conversation, but also capricious. In 1839, Mary moved to Springfield to live with her sister Elizabeth and brother-in-law Ninian Edwards. There, in Springfield's high society, Mary was pursued by many, including Stephen A. Douglas, a promising lawyer and politician. But Mary was drawn to Lincoln. This was an unusual match. Mary came from Kentucky's elite, accustomed to a life of luxury. Lincoln was the son of a poor farmer with virtually no formal education. Mary was 5 feet 2 inches, Lincoln 6 feet 4 inches, a difference of 14 inches, 35 centimeters. Mary loved literature, poetry, opera, and Parisian fashion. Lincoln preferred reading law books and telling crude jokes. But they had one important thing in common. Both were passionate about politics, both were Whigs, and both were ambitious. In particular, Mary believed Lincoln would become president. She later recounted that from their first meeting she told her friends, "He will be president someday, and I will be first lady." This wasn't a crazy claim, as some might think. Mary had a keen political eye and recognized Lincoln's talent before many others. In early 1840, Lincoln and Mary became engaged. But on January 1, 1841, a day Lincoln would later call "my first fateful day," he broke off the engagement. The exact reason for this remains a historical mystery, but several theories exist. First, Lincoln was plagued by doubts about his financial capabilities. He earned about $1,500 a year, a pretty good amount, but Mary was accustomed to a life of luxury. He feared he wouldn't be able to provide her with the life she deserved. Secondly, the Edwards family strongly opposed the marriage. Ninian Edwards stated bluntly that Lincoln had no prospects and was unworthy of Mary. Elizabeth Edwards called Lincoln a man without a future. This social pressure weighed heavily on Lincoln. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Lincoln may have been attracted to Matilda Edwards, the granddaughter of Ninian Edwards, a beautiful young woman who had recently arrived in Springfield. Some sources say Lincoln felt torn between his duty to Mary and his attraction to Matilda. Whatever the reason, breaking off the engagement plunged Lincoln into the most severe depression of his life. For weeks he was unable to work, refused to attend the House of Commons, and lay in bed in despair. Joshua Speed wrote, "Lincoln was so miserable I had to take his razor away. I feared he would kill himself." In a letter to John Todd Stewart dated January 23, 1841, Lincoln wrote, "I am the most unhappy man alive. If what I feel were distributed equally among the entire human family, there would be no happy face on earth." William Herndon recalled, "His friends had to watch him daily for fear he would harm himself." This crisis lasted for months. Lincoln gradually recovered thanks to the care of Joshua Speed and other friends, but the pain never completely disappeared. In early 1842, Lincoln and Mary were reunited through the arrangement of Simeon Francis, editor of the Sangamo Journal. Francis invited them both to his home, and gradually they began meeting secretly. Mary forgave Lincoln. She understood his pain and believed in his potential. On November 4, 1842, in a sudden decision, Lincoln informed Reverend Charles Dresser that he wanted to marry that very day. The Edwards family was shocked, but they insisted that the wedding should at least take place at their home. Within hours, a simple wedding was held. There were about 30 guests. Lincoln, in his new suit, looked anxious. When James Matheny, his best man, asked him how he felt, Lincoln replied, "I feel like I'm going to execution." Mary's wedding ring was engraved with the words, A.L. to Mary, November 4, 1842. Love is eternal. It was a beautiful promise, but the marriage ahead would be a great challenge for both of them. The couple moved to Globe Tavern, a modest boarding house costing $4 a week. This was a far cry from Edward's mansion where Mary had lived. But Mary didn't complain. She believed in Lincoln and in their future. On August 1, 1843, Lincoln's first son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was born. Robert was named after his maternal grandfather. This was a great joy for the young family. Lincoln devoted himself to caring for his son. He pushed the stroller down the street, rocked him to sleep, and played with him whenever he had free time. But the relationship between Lincoln and Robert was never truly close. Robert later wrote, "My father was always absent, either working or traveling. When I was 16 and attending Harvard, he became president. We hardly had any time for each other." This was a great sorrow for both of them. On March 10, 1846, their second son, Edward Baker Lincoln, Eddie, was born. Eddie was named after Edward Dickinson Baker, a close friend of Lincoln's. He was small and frail, but lovable. Mary especially loved Eddie. Then tragedy struck. In December 1849, Eddie fell seriously ill, possibly diphtheria or tuberculosis. For 52 days he suffered, coughed, and gradually wasted away. Lincoln and Mary stayed up all night by his bedside praying for a miracle. But on the morning of February 1, 1850, Eddie died, just weeks before his 4th birthday. Mary was almost completely broken. She lay in bed for weeks, neither eating nor speaking, only weeping. Lincoln was also deeply distressed, but he had to be strong for his wife. In a poem, Lincoln wrote of Eddie, "Our little son is gone. Angels call him to heaven." Eddie's funeral was held at Lincoln's home. Reverend James Smith of the First Presbyterian Church presided over the service. Smith's words of comfort had a profound impact on both Lincoln and Mary. Afterward, they frequently attended church, seeking solace in the faith. 10 months after Eddie's death, on December 21, 1850, William Wallace Lincoln, Willie, was born. Willie was named after Dr. William Wallace, the husband of his sister Mary. Willie was a beautiful, intelligent, and gentle child. Lincoln especially loved Willie, calling him the sweetest little boy. On April 4, 1853, his 4th and final son, Thomas Lincoln, Tad, was born. Tad was named after his grandfather, Thomas Lincoln. From birth, Tad had a problem. He had a cleft lip and palate, which made his speech difficult and incomprehensible. Lincoln called him Tad, Tadpole, because he wobbled like a tadpole when he was a baby. Willie and Tad became the center of Lincoln's life. He brought them to his law office, letting them play, break things, and cause trouble. William Herndon recalled with frustration, "These kids pulled books off the shelves, bent pens, spilled ink, and ruined everything." Lincoln never stopped them. But for Lincoln, his children were the greatest joy of his life. The marriage between Lincoln and Mary is one of the most complex stories in American history. For years, historians have debated, was it a happy marriage or a disaster? The truth is, both. Mary was an intelligent woman with strong political ambitions and unwavering faith in her husband. When Lincoln doubted his abilities, Mary encouraged him. When he failed, she said, "You will succeed. You have a great destiny." She read his speeches, offered advice, and connected him with important people. In many ways, Mary was Lincoln's first campaign manager. But Mary also had serious problems. She had a volatile temper. She could be sweet and charming one moment, then yelling and throwing things the next. Neighbors often heard Mary yelling at Lincoln. Once, she chased him out of the house with a broom. Another time, she threw potatoes in his face. Lincoln endured it all with incredible patience. He never yelled back, never raised his hand against his wife. When Mary was angry, he would leave the house, go for a walk, and wait for her to calm down. He told his friends, "Mary has a good heart. She's just stressed." Lincoln's closest friends knew that he loved Mary deeply, despite the difficult marriage. Part of the problem was money. Mary was accustomed to a life of luxury, but Lincoln earned a modest income. She spent lavishly on clothes, furniture, and parties. Lincoln worried about debt, but rarely refused Mary. Finally, in 1844, Lincoln bought a house at the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield for $1,500. This was the only house Lincoln ever owned, where the family lived until they moved to the White House. Another issue was Mary's mental health. Many historians believe Mary suffered from bipolar disorder or severe depression. She had periods of deep sadness, followed by periods of euphoria and wasteful spending. She frequently suffered from severe migraine headaches. In 1863, after a carriage accident, she sustained a serious head injury, and her symptoms worsened. But through it all, Mary was Lincoln's loyal companion. She was the only one who believed in him when no one else did. And Lincoln, despite their difficult marriage, never abandoned her. In 1846, Lincoln ran for the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Illinois. This was a major step from state politics to the national level. Lincoln won easily and became the Whig Party's representative for the 1847 to 1849 term. In December 1847, Lincoln, Mary, Robert, 4 years old, and Eddie, 21 months old, set off for Washington, D.C. This was the family's first time leaving Illinois. They stayed at Mrs. Spriggs' boarding house near the Capitol. Washington at that time was a small, dirty city with muddy streets and no proper drainage system. In the House of Representatives, Lincoln was one of many young, unremarkable delegates. But he quickly drew attention for his stance against the Mexican War, 1846 to 1848. President James K. Polk, a Democrat, had led the United States into this war on the grounds that Mexico had attacked American territory. Lincoln did not believe this. On December 22, 1847, Lincoln issued the Spot Resolutions, a series of resolutions requiring Polk to pinpoint the exact spot where American blood had been shed on American soil. Lincoln argued that the war was unjust, started by Polk to seize Mexican territory. This was a bold and unpopular stance. Many Americans, especially in Illinois, supported the war. They viewed Lincoln as a traitor who opposed the military. Some newspapers even called him Spotty Lincoln, a derogatory term. This stance may have ended Lincoln's political career, but it also revealed his principle. He was willing to sacrifice his career to fight for what he believed was right. During his term, Lincoln also proposed a bill to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., but with compensation for slave owners and only if a majority of D.C. voters agreed. This was a moderate, compromising position, but the bill was never voted on. Mary was unhappy with life in Washington. She felt isolated. Other members of the House of Representatives wouldn't invite her family to social gatherings because Lincoln was only a low-ranking delegate. Finally, in May 1848, Mary took her children back to Kentucky to live with Todd's family, while Lincoln remained in Washington alone to complete his term. Lincoln did not run for a second term. According to the Whig Party agreement, The position would be rotated. But the truth was that Lincoln knew his anti-war stance had damaged his political prospects in Illinois. In March 1849, he left Washington and returned to Springfield, feeling defeated and disillusioned. From 1849 to 1854, Lincoln withdrew from politics and focused on his legal career. This was the most successful period of his legal career. He handled major cases, represented railroad companies, and earned a good income, around $3,000 a year, a considerable sum at the time. In 1850, the death of Eddie Lincoln plunged him into a period of profound grief, but his work helped him stay sane. He buried himself in legal files, circling from one court to another, and tried not to dwell on the pain. These years were also a time of deep reflection on slavery in Lincoln. He had always hated slavery. His anti-slavery Baptist education, his witnessing of the slave markets in New Orleans, and his moral principles all led him to view slavery as a sin. But he was also a realist. He knew that the Constitution protected slaves in states that already had slaves. He believed that the federal government had no power to abolish slavery in those states. But Lincoln insisted that slavery should not be extended into new territories. He believed that if slavery was limited, it would gradually disappear. This was the free soil strategy of the Republican Party later on. On May 30, 1854, the United States Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, sponsored by Senator Stephen A. Douglas. This act repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, an agreement that prohibited slavery in territories north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel. Instead, the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed residents of the new territories to decide through popular sovereignty whether or not they wanted slaves. For Lincoln, this was a moral and political disaster. The act paved the way for the unlimited expansion of slavery, no longer any geographical boundaries. It destroyed the compromise that the founders had established, and it was based on the erroneous assumption that slavery was a normal issue that could be decided by a majority vote, rather than a moral crime. Lincoln began speaking out publicly. In October 1854, in Peoria, Illinois, he delivered a 3-hour speech, later known as the Peoria Speech, analyzing and criticizing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This was Lincoln's most important speech to date, where he first comprehensively presented his anti-slavery philosophy. Lincoln argued that slavery was morally wrong. He quoted the Declaration of Independence, "All men are created equal." This included black people. Slavery violated this fundamental principle. But Lincoln was also practical. He didn't call for the immediate abolition of slavery in the southern states. That would have violated the Constitution and could have led to civil war. Instead, he proposed halting the expansion of slavery, isolating it, and allowing it to die out naturally. The Peoria speech brought Lincoln back into the political spotlight. Whigs and anti-slavery activists from both parties began to see him as a potential leader. The Kansas-Nebraska Act destroyed the Whig Party. The party's northern and southern members could no longer cooperate. In this void, a new party emerged, the Republican Party, founded in 1854 with a single platform: opposition to the expansion of slavery. Lincoln was initially hesitant to join the new party. He still considered himself a Whig. But in 1856, when the Whig Party completely collapsed, Lincoln officially joined the Republican Party. He quickly became one of the party's leaders in Illinois. In 1856, at the first Republican National Convention in Philadelphia, Lincoln's name was put forward for vice president. He received 110 votes, coming in second to William L. Dayton. Although he did not win, the nomination put Lincoln on the national political map. On June 16, 1858, the Illinois Republican Party Convention met in Springfield to nominate a candidate for the United States Senate. They chose Abraham Lincoln to challenge incumbent Stephen A. Douglas. This was an unusual decision. Normally, parties did not nominate candidates beforehand because senators were elected by state legislators, not by direct vote. But the Republicans wanted to present a clear choice. At 8 p.m., Lincoln stood up to deliver his acceptance speech. He had prepared it meticulously, writing and rewriting it many times and reading it to a few close friends. Many advised him against using overly strong language, but Lincoln was adamant. The speech began with words that would resonate through history. "A house divided from itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot remain half slave, half free forever." Lincoln explained he did not expect the Union to disintegrate, but he did expect it to stop being divided. America would become either completely enslaved or completely free. This was a bold and controversial statement. Lincoln subsequently alleged a conspiracy to nationalize slavery, a conspiracy involving Stephen Douglas, President James Buchanan, Chief Justice Taney, and former President Franklin Pierce. He argued that the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, and Buchanan's policies were all part of a larger plan to legalize slavery everywhere, including the northern states. This was a serious accusation, and many believed it was too extreme. Even William Herndon, Lincoln's partner and supporter, worried that the speech was too strong. But Lincoln believed this was the time to speak the truth clearly. Lincoln's "The Divided House" speech made him nationally famous. The press covered it extensively, and it was debated everywhere. Douglas later claimed that the speech proved Lincoln to be an extreme abolitionist. But that wasn't Lincoln's intention. He only wanted to prevent the expansion of slavery, not abolish it where it already existed. Following Lincoln's nomination, the 1858 Illinois Senate campaign began. Stephen A. Douglas was a political giant, 5 feet 4 inches, 1.63 meters tall, but known as Little Giant because of his influence. Douglas was an eloquent speaker, a skilled politician, and a powerful incumbent with vast financial backing. Lincoln proposed a series of face-to-face debates. Douglas was initially reluctant, but eventually agreed to 7 debates in different towns across Illinois. Ottawa, August 21st, Freeport, August 27th, Jonesboro, September 15th, Charleston, September 18th, Galesburg, October 7th, Quincy, October 13th, and Alton, October 15th. Each debate lasted 3 hours. The first speaker spoke for an hour, the second for an hour and a half, and the first speaker concluded in 30 minutes. Thousands of people gathered to watch, sometimes 15,000 to 20,000. It was entertainment, education, and politics all at once. The debates centered on slavery, but with nuanced perspectives. Douglas defended populist sovereignty, letting each territory decide for itself. He argued that he didn't care whether slaves were voted up or down as long as the people decided. Douglas also exploited racism. He claimed that Lincoln wanted equality for black people, which would lead to interracial marriage and racial mixing. Lincoln countered that slavery was morally wrong, that it violated the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and that populist sovereignty was a cover for the expansion of slavery. He argued that black people, while inferior to white people in many respects, still had a fundamental freedom, the right to enjoy the fruits of their own labor. But Lincoln also made it clear that he did not advocate for social or political equality between white and black people. During the Charleston debate, he stated, "I have never advocated for bringing about social and political equality between the white and black races. I have never advocated for making black people voters or jury members, nor for allowing them to hold office or marry white people." These words, abhorrent by modern standards, reflected the prevailing views of the time and Lincoln's political strategy to appeal to a neutral electorate. The climax of the debate came at Freeport when Lincoln asked Douglas, could the people of a territory prohibit slavery before it became a state, despite Dred Scott's decision? Douglas replied that yes, the people could refuse to enact laws protecting slaves, and without such laws, slavery could not exist. This answer, known as the Freeport Doctrine, helped Douglas win the Illinois election, but destroyed his national prospects. Southerners viewed Douglas as a traitor. When Douglas ran for president in 1860, the Southern Democratic Party abandoned him. The Illinois Senate election took place in November 1858. The Republicans won the popular vote, but due to the division of electoral districts, the Democrats won a majority in the state House of Representatives. As a result, Stephen Douglas was re-elected to the Senate. Lincoln lost. Although he lost the debate, Lincoln won in a different way. The debates received widespread national press coverage. Lincoln's speeches were printed and widely distributed. Suddenly, Abraham Lincoln was no longer an unknown lawyer from Illinois. He was one of the leading thinkers of the anti-slavery movement. Lincoln began receiving invitations to speak from across the North. In February 1860, he delivered one of his most important speeches at the Cooper Union in New York City. Before an audience of 1,500, including many influential journalists and politicians, Lincoln presented a strong legal and historical argument that the Founding Fathers had intended Congress to have limited power over slavery in the territories. He concluded with a powerful appeal. Let us have faith that authority creates power, and in that faith let us, to the very end, dare to do our duty as we understand it. The speech received enthusiastic applause. The press lauded Lincoln as an outstanding thinker and orator. When the Republican National Convention met in Chicago in May 1860, Lincoln had become a serious contender for the presidential nomination. The leading candidate was William H. Seward of New York, a seasoned and well-known politician. But Seward was also a double-edged sword. He was too extreme for many moderate voters. Lincoln, on the other hand, had an advantage. He was from the West, from the crucial state of Illinois. He had a clear anti-slavery stance, but wasn't an abolitionist. He had no major political enemies. He had a brilliant campaign team under the leadership of David Davis and Norman Judd. After 3 rounds of voting on May 18, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was nominated as the Republican Party's presidential candidate. Hannibal Hamlin of Maine was chosen as vice president. The news was sent to Springfield by telegram. Lincoln, who was playing a casual baseball game, received the message and said, "I must go home immediately. There is a woman there who wants to know this." Mary Todd Lincoln was right all along. Her husband, the boy from the cabin, who was once called No Good Prospects, is now the presidential candidate of the United States. But this victory also marked the beginning of the most tragic period in American history and in the life of Abraham Lincoln. The 1860 presidential election was one of the most important and contentious in U.S. history. The Democratic Party was completely divided. Stephen A. Douglas represented the Northern Democrats, John C. Breckinridge represented the Southern Democrats, and John Bell represented the newly formed Constitutional Union. This division created a perfect opportunity for Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party. Lincoln conducted a careful campaign. Traditionally, presidential candidates did not campaign in person. Lincoln stayed in Springfield, receiving guests, writing letters, and having his allies speak on his behalf. His strategy was to emphasize moderation. He was not an abolitionist. He simply wanted to prevent the expansion of slavery and protect the Union. On November 6, 1860, the election results were announced. Abraham Lincoln won with 180 electoral votes, while Breckinridge had 72. Bell had 39, and Douglas only 12, despite winning the second highest popular vote. Lincoln received approximately 40% of the popular vote, a relative majority, not an absolute majority. More importantly, Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 9 southern states. The reaction from the South was immediate and fierce. Southern leaders viewed Lincoln's victory as an existential threat. They believed a Republican president would eventually abolish slavery, destroy their economy, and overturn the social order. They had warned for years that if a Republican were elected, they would secede from the Union. On December 20, 1860, just 6 weeks after the election, South Carolina officially declared its secession from the United States.
The Declaration of Secession clearly stated its reason. A growing proportion of slave-free states has led to their failure to honor their obligations. In January and February 1861, 6 more states followed suit. Mississippi, 9/1, Florida, October 1st, Alabama, November 1st, Georgia, September 19th, Louisiana, February 26th, and Texas, January 2nd. On February 4th, 1861, the secessionist states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed the Confederate States of America. They drafted their own constitution, closely resembling the U.S. Constitution, but explicitly protecting the right to slave ownership. Jefferson Davis, a former Mississippi senator and Secretary of War, was elected president. Alexander H. Stephens was elected vice president. Meanwhile, Lincoln remained in Springfield, awaiting his inauguration on March 4th. The incumbent president, James Buchanan, a weak Democrat, declared that secession was illegal, but that the federal government had no power to prevent it, a contradictory and futile stance. Lincoln could do nothing until his inauguration, but he sent private messages affirming that he would defend the Union. On March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as the 16th President of the United States. In his inaugural address, he attempted to be both firm and conciliatory. He stated clearly, "I have no intention, directly or indirectly, of interfering with slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no legal right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." But he also affirmed, "No state can legally secede from the Union. Resolutions and decrees to that end are legally invalid." He concluded with an emotional plea. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not become enemies. Although passion can be intense, it must not break the bond of our friendship." But eloquent words could not prevent the impending crisis. Lincoln immediately faced the problem of Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, commanded by Major Robert Anderson. Anderson and his 85 soldiers were surrounded by Confederate forces. Food supplies were running low. Lincoln had to decide, abandon the fort and implicitly recognize secession, or resupply and risk provoking war. His cabinet was divided. Secretary of State William H. Seward advised abandoning the fort to avoid conflict. Others argued that abandoning the fort would be a sign of weakness and could encourage the border states to secede. After weeks of careful consideration, Lincoln made his decision. He would resupply Fort Sumter, but only with food and necessities, without weapons or reinforcements. He informed the governor of South Carolina of this intention. In this way, Lincoln placed the deciding burden on the Confederates. They could leave the fort alone and avoid war, or attack and become the instigator of the conflict. The Confederates chose to attack. On the morning of April 12, 1861, at 4:30 a.m., Confederate artillery under the command of Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. Anderson and his soldiers retaliated but were completely overwhelmed. On April 13th, with the fort burning and ammunition depleted, Anderson surrendered. Miraculously, no one died in the war. The only casualties occurred in a random shooting during the flag-lowering ceremony. But the American Civil War had begun. On April 15, 1861, Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to serve 3 months to suppress the rebellion and reclaim federal properties. The response from the North was overwhelmingly enthusiastic. Thousands of young men rushed to enlist. They believed the war would be short, glorious, and end before the fall. But this call also propelled 4 other states to the Confederate side. Virginia seceded on April 17th, Arkansas on May 6th, North Carolina on May 20th, and Tennessee on June 8th. The loss of Virginia was a particularly heavy blow to Lincoln. It was the largest and wealthiest state in the South, home to the most important arms manufacturer at Tredegar Iron Works, and the birthplace of George Washington. Richmond, Virginia, became the new capital of the Confederacy. Lincoln faced a daunting task. The Confederacy comprised 11 states with a population of approximately 9 million, including 3.5 million enslaved people. The Union had 23 states with a population of approximately 22 million. But the Union had a tremendous advantage in industry, railroads, and a navy. The question was whether Lincoln could maintain the unity of the North and fight a war far longer than anticipated. The years 1861 to 1862 were a painful period for both Lincoln and the Union. On July 21, 1861, at the First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, the Union Army suffered a devastating defeat just 25 miles from Washington. Soldiers and civilians from Washington had gone to watch the battle as if it were a picnic, bringing wine and sandwiches, and were shocked when they had to flee in panic. Lincoln realized that the war would be long and terrible. He appointed General George B. McClellan to command the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was an excellent organizer, but a frustrated general. He trained his troops thoroughly, but refused to attack, always finding reasons to delay. Lincoln visited McClellan several times, urging him to act. Once, in frustration, Lincoln wrote, "If General McClellan is unwilling to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a while." But McClellan still refused to move. Meanwhile, at home, personal tragedy struck Lincoln. In February 1862, his 11-year-old son Willie fell seriously ill, possibly typhoid fever caused by contaminated water in Washington. Willie was Lincoln's most beloved child, intelligent, gentle, and much like his father. Lincoln sat by his son's bedside for days, praying and hoping. But on February 20th, 1862, Willie died. Lincoln was on the verge of collapse. Elizabeth Keckley, Mary's seamstress, recalled, "I saw the president go to the room where Willie's body lay, lift the coffin lid, look into his son's castle face, his hands trembling. Then, almost delirious with grief, he cried out, 'My dear son, my dear son.'" Mary Todd Lincoln completely lost control. She didn't leave her room for weeks, wept incessantly, and held spiritual gatherings to try to connect with Willie. She never fully recovered. This grief weighed heavily on Lincoln for the rest of his life. He once told a friend, "When I went downstairs that night to see Willie's body, even though I had lost my mother and my brother, I couldn't recall any pain quite like that." But Lincoln had no time for proper mourning. The war was entering its second year, and pressure from the radical Republicans was mounting to turn it into a slave truce. Initially, Lincoln insisted that the sole objective of the war was to defend the Union, not to free the slaves. In a letter to editor Horace Greeley in August 1862, he wrote, "My ultimate goal in this struggle is to save the Union, not to save or destroy slaves. If I can save the Union without freeing any slaves, I will do so. If I can save it by freeing all slaves, I will do so. And if I can save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I will do that too." But the reality was that Lincoln had secretly been preparing an Emancipation Proclamation since July 1862. He recognized that slavery was the backbone of the Confederate economy. Slaves grew food, built fortifications, and freed white men to fight. Emancipating slaves would weaken the Confederacy. Furthermore, it would prevent Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy, as both nations had abolished slavery and could not openly support a slave-based state. On July 22, 1862, Lincoln read the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. Its contents were shocking. Seward advised Lincoln to wait for a military victory before publishing it, otherwise it would appear like a desperate act.
That victory came on September 17th, 1862, at Antietam, Maryland. In the deadliest single-day battle in American history, with over 22,000 casualties, Union troops under McClellan's command repelled General Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces. It wasn't a decisive victory. McClellan didn't pursue Lee, but it was enough for Lincoln. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. As of January 1, 1863, all enslaved persons in the states or parts of states that remain rebellious shall be free from now on and forever. This proclamation did not emancipate slaves in the border states loyal to the Union, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, or in Confederate territories that had been taken over by the Union. It applied only to areas where Lincoln had no real power. Critics ironically argue that Lincoln emancipated slaves only where he was incapable of doing so. But this was a very clever move politically and legally. Lincoln acted as commander-in-chief during wartime, using his war powers. He couldn't free slaves in loyalist states because that would violate their property rights protected by the Constitution. But he could confiscate the enemy's property during the war. And most importantly, the proclamation transformed war from a struggle for state rights into a fight for human liberty. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. His hand trembled, not from doubt, but because he had just shaken hands with hundreds of people at the White House New Year's Eve celebration. He said, "If my soul has ever been in any act, it is in this one. If my name has ever been to have meaning in history, it will be for this one." The year 1863 brought both hope and sorrow. In May, the Union suffered a crushing defeat at Chancellorsville. But in that battle, Confederate General Stonewall Jackson was mistakenly shot by his own troops and killed, a major loss for the Confederates. In July 1863, two crucial events occurred simultaneously. From July 1st to 3rd, at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Robert E. Lee's army and the Union forces under General George G. Meade clashed in the most decisive battle of the war. In 3 days of fierce fighting, with over 50,000 casualties, the Union repelled the Confederates. On July 3rd, in a desperate attack known as Pickett's Charge, 12,500 Confederate soldiers stormed Cemetery Ridge, only to be annihilated by Union fire. Lee was forced to retreat to Virginia. Gettysburg was the turning point of the war. From here, the Confederates could never advance north again. On the same day, July 4th, Vicksburg, Mississippi, a key Confederate fortress on the Mississippi River, surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant after a 47-day siege. The Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River, cutting the Confederacy in two. Lincoln welcomed these victories, but was also frustrated that Meade did not pursue and destroy Lee's army. He said, "We had the enemy within our grasp, and all we had to do was stretch out our hand and they were ours." But nothing was done. In November 1863, Lincoln was invited to Gettysburg to speak at the dedication of the National Cemetery, where thousands of fallen soldiers were buried. The main speaker was Edward Everett, a renowned orator, who spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln was asked to say a few words. Lincoln wrote his speech carefully, giving deep thought to the meaning of war. On November 19, 1863, before a crowd of about 15,000 people, Lincoln stood and spoke for about 2 minutes, just 272 words. 87 years ago, our ancestors laid the foundation on this continent for a new nation, born in freedom, and dedicated to the premise that all men are created equal. The speech was brief but profound. Lincoln redefined war not merely as a struggle to save the Union, but as a test of whether a nation based on liberty and equality could survive. He praised those who had sacrificed themselves and urged those who survived to fulfill their unfinished duty so that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not vanish from the earth. At the time, many thought the speech was too short and unimpressive. Everett later wrote to Lincoln, "I would be pleased if I could deceive myself into thinking that I came as close to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." But it took many years for the world to realize that the Gettysburg Address was one of the greatest speeches ever written. In March 1864, Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant as Commander-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant was the man Lincoln had been looking for, a decisive general, ready to fight without excuses. Grant wasn't as refined as McClellan, lacked a glittering military education, and had a reputation for alcoholism. But he knew how to win. Grant developed a total war strategy, attacking the Confederates on all fronts simultaneously, giving them no time to regroup or move reinforcements. He placed General William Tecumseh Sherman in command of the Western Army with orders to advance into Georgia. He himself commanded the Army of the Potomac against Lee in Virginia. The 1864 campaign was a horrific bloodbath. At Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, Petersburg, tens of thousands died in battles with no clear victory. Grant was criticized as a butcher, but he did not back down. He knew that the Union could compensate for casualties, while the Confederates could not. Lincoln fully supported Grant. When a delegation came to complain about casualties, Lincoln responded, "I cannot assist General Grant. That is a job that must be done." Lincoln had learned that victory required ruthless determination. In September 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta, a crucial victory both militarily and psychologically. Lincoln, campaigning for re-election, needed this victory to demonstrate that the war was being won. In November 1864, Lincoln was re-elected, defeating Democratic candidate George McClellan, his former general. This victory validated Lincoln's strategy and his determination to win the war. In early 1865, the war was drawing to a close. Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army was besieged at Petersburg, Virginia, starving and exhausted. William Sherman marched through the Carolinas, destroying everything in his path. The Confederacy was collapsing. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln was sworn in for his second term. In his second inaugural address, he did not celebrate victory or boast about his achievements. Instead, he reflected on the profound meaning of this terrible war. Both sides read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, yet each side appealed to his help against the other. Neither side's prayers could be fully answered. Neither's were fully answered. He concluded with the most beautiful words ever spoken in the context of war. With no ill will toward anyone, with compassion toward all, with steadfastness in what is right, as God has shown us what is right. Let us strive together to accomplish the work we are doing, to heal the wounds of the nation, to care for those who have suffered in battle and their widows and orphans, to do everything possible to achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among us and with all nations. This was Lincoln's vision for the Reconstruction era, not revenge, not punishment, but reconciliation and healing. But fate would not give him the opportunity to realize this vision. On April 2, 1865, Petersburg fell to the Union. Lee and what remained of his army, about 28,000 men, hungry, thirsty, and exhausted, retreated westward. On April 3rd, Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, was abandoned. Lincoln visited Richmond the following day, walking through the ruined streets, surrounded by newly freed slaves who knelt before him. Lincoln told them, "Do not kneel before me. That is only fitting for God. You are free. Stand up and keep your freedom." On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, General Robert E. Lee met with Ulysses S. Grant to negotiate his surrender. Lee, once elegant and imposing, was now thin and exhausted. Grant, still wearing his mud-stained uniform from the battlefield, treated Lee with respect. Grant offered generous terms of surrender. Confederate soldiers could go home, keep their personal horses for plowing, and would not be prosecuted for treason. Officers could keep their secondary weapons. Union generals were instructed not to hold victory celebrations or mock the defeated. Lee signed the surrender document. As he left McLean House, Union soldiers began firing celebratory shots. Grant ordered them to stop immediately. "The war is over. The rebels are our fellow countrymen once again." When the news reached Washington, the city erupted in joy. People danced in the streets, church bells rang, and fireworks exploded. The war had ended after 4 years and 620,000 deaths, 2% of the U.S. population. It remains the deadliest conflict in American history. Lincoln was joyful, but exhausted. 4 years as president during the war had aged him 20 years. His face was wrinkled, his hair was white, and his eyes held a deep sadness. But he was also full of hope for the future, for healing the nation, rebuilding the South, and integrating free black people into American society. On April 11th, Lincoln addressed the White House balcony about his Reconstruction plan. Specifically, he proposed that educated black people and those who had served in the Union military should be granted the right to vote. This was the first time a U.S. president had publicly supported suffrage for black people. Among the listening crowd was a young man named John Wilkes Booth. Upon hearing Lincoln's proposal, Booth said to his companion, "That was the last speech he would ever give. Now, by God, I will execute him." John Wilkes Booth was born in 1838 in Maryland, the son of Junius Brutus Booth, a renowned stage actor. He became one of the most famous actors of his time, handsome, talented, and wealthy. But he was also a fervent Confederate supporter, hating Lincoln and everything he represented. Booth initially planned to kidnap Lincoln and demand the release of Confederate prisoners. But after Lee surrendered and the Confederacy collapsed, Booth decided to assassinate Lincoln. He recruited a group of conspirators: Lewis Powell, or Payne, George Atzerodt, David Harold, and others. The plan was to kill Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward simultaneously, thus bringing down the U.S. government. April 14, 1865, Good Friday. Lincoln planned to see the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. Mary Lincoln wanted to go, and Lincoln, though tired, agreed. They invited General Grant and his wife, but Grant declined. Some believe Mrs. Grant disliked Mary Lincoln. Eventually, Clara Harris and her fiancé, Major Henry Rathbone, joined Lincoln and Mary. Booth knew that Lincoln would be coming to Ford's Theater. He was a regular performer there and familiar with every corner of the building. He prepared meticulously, surveying the entrances and exits, preparing a fast horse outside, and bringing along a single-barreled Derringer pistol and a large knife. Around 8:30 p.m. on April 14th, Lincoln and Mary arrived at Ford's Theater. The play had already begun, but as Lincoln entered, the performance paused. The orchestra played Hail to the Chief, and the audience rose to their feet and applauded. Lincoln bowed and went upstairs to the state box. Boxes 7 and 8 joined together. He sat in an armchair, Mary beside him, and Clara and Henry on the other side of the box. The play continued. Lincoln, tired but trying to relax, watched and occasionally smiled. Mary held his hand. She whispered, "What will they think when they see me holding you like this?" Lincoln replied, "They won't think anything at all." At approximately 10:15 p.m., during Act 3, Scene 2, with only one actor remaining on stage and the audience laughing at a joke, Booth sneaks into the presidential box. He had locked the door from the outside beforehand, and Lincoln's bodyguard, John Parker, an irresponsible police officer, had left his post to go drinking. Booth stepped up behind Lincoln.
He raised his derringer to the president's head and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Lincoln behind his left ear, sprue through his brain, and stopped just behind his right eye. Lincoln collapsed forward. Mary screamed. Major Rathbone lunged at Booth, but Booth stabbed him in the arm. Booth leaped from the box onto the stage, a 12-foot jump, but his shoe caught on a decorative flag, causing him to fall awkwardly onto the stage, breaking his left leg. Despite his injury, Booth stood up, brandishing his knife and shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis!" Such always with tyrants, a Virginia slogan, and "The South has been avenged!" Then he limped out the back door, mounted his horse, and disappeared into the night. Ford's Theater was in chaos. People were shouting, "Catch the assassin! Kill him!" A young doctor named Charles Leal in the audience ran up to the president's box. He examined Lincoln and realized the fatal wound. The bullet had destroyed Lincoln's brain. The president was unconscious, struggling to breathe, and had a weak pulse. Lincoln was too heavy and too severely injured to be moved to the White House or a hospital. They carried him across the street to Peterson House, a rented house across from the theater. Lincoln was placed on a bed that was too short for his large body. They had to lay him diagonally. Doctors arrived and did everything they could, but there was no hope. Mary, nearly driven mad with grief, sat beside him, holding her husband's hand, weeping and crying out, "Tell me he will live. Tell me he will live." Robert Lincoln, 21, arrived from the White House and stood by his father's bedside, weeping. Cabinet members arrived. Stanton, Seward, maligned in a simultaneous attack by Lewis Powell, but survived. Wells, and others. Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who had once clashed with Lincoln, but eventually came to deeply respect him, took on the task of investigating and defending the government. He feared a larger conspiracy, a coup. He sent telegrams, deployed troops, and questioned witnesses. Throughout the night, Lincoln lay unconscious, his breathing growing weaker. Doctors occasionally removed fragments of bone and brain from his wounds. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln breathed his last. He died at the age of 56. Edwin Stanton, with tears in his eyes, said, "Now he belongs to the age." Some sources say he said, "Now he belongs to the angels," but the original version is more widely accepted. Lincoln was the first American president to be assassinated. The entire nation was plunged into grief and outrage. Black people in particular wept. They had lost their liberator. One black woman in Washington said, "We don't have friends like him. He loved us and died for us." Lincoln's office was located at the White House, where thousands came to pay their respects. The funeral procession then lasted 13 days, carrying Lincoln's coffin from Washington to Springfield, stopping in numerous cities along the way: Baltimore, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York, Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, Chicago, and finally, Springfield. An estimated 7 million people, about 20% of the U.S. population, saw the funeral procession or stood by the roadside as it passed. On May 4, 1865, Lincoln was buried at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, next to his sons Eddie and Willie. Willie's body had been brought back from Washington. Meanwhile, the hunt for Booth was underway. Police and military searched throughout Maryland and Virginia. On April 26th, Booth and David Harold were surrounded in a tobacco warehouse near Port Royal, Virginia. Harold surrendered, but Booth refused. Soldiers set the warehouse on fire. Sergeant Boston Corbett, disobeying orders to capture him alive, fired through a gap and struck Booth in the neck. Booth was dragged out, paralyzed, and died a few hours later. His last words were reportedly, "Tell my mother that I died for my country." Other conspirators were arrested. In a military trial, Lewis Powell, David Harold, George Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt, the innkeeper where the conspirators met, were sentenced to death and hanged on July 7, 1865. Others received long prison sentences.
Justice had been served, but Lincoln was gone. So we have journeyed together through the epic path of Abraham Lincoln, from a wooden cabin in Kentucky to the White House, from an illiterate orphan boy to the greatest president in U.S. history. Lincoln's life is a testament to the power of the human will. He lost his mother at age 9, his sister at 18, his lover Anne Rutledge at 26, his son Eddie at 41, and his son Willie at 53. He endured lifelong depression, a challenging marriage, and fierce criticism from all sides. But he never gave up. Lincoln was not a saint. He held racial views that we would consider unacceptable today. He compromised when necessary, sometimes violating the Constitution during wartime, suspending habeas corpus, arresting without trial, and making decisions that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands. But in the context of his time, Lincoln was a visionary leader with profound compassion and an unwavering commitment to justice. Lincoln's three great speeches, the Divided House, the Gettysburg Address, and the Second Inaugural Address, redefined the meaning of America. Before Lincoln, people said, "The United States is," plural. After Lincoln, people said, "The United States is," singular. He transformed a collection of states into a nation. And ultimately, Lincoln's story is a story of hope. He proved that in America, anyone, no matter how poor their circumstances, no matter how lacking in education or family advantages, can achieve the highest positions. This is the American dream in its purest form. When we look back at Lincoln's life from 160 years ago, we see a man, not a monument, not a legend, but a flesh and blood human being with all his flaws and greatness. And that is why his story continues to inspire us today. If Lincoln, with all his suffering and hardship, could rise above and change the world, then perhaps we can too. As Edwin Stanton said in that small room on the morning of April 15, 1865, now he belongs to his time. Abraham Lincoln belonged not only to his time, he belonged to all times. He was an example of leadership in crisis, of compassion in conflict, and of faith in the better potential of human nature. Thank you for joining History PhD on this journey to explore the tragic life of Abraham Lincoln. If this story has touched your heart, please like, share to spread the word, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other fascinating historical stories. Please leave your comments about Lincoln and the lessons we can learn from his life for today. Until we meet again in the next episode, remember, history is not just the past. It is a mirror reflecting the present and a beacon illuminating the future. See you soon.